Now, we'll look at the muscles of the pelvic cavity. First, we'll look at two muscles which form part of the wall of the pelvic cavity, piriformis and obturator internus. Then, we'll look at the complex sheet of muscles, collectively called the pelvic diaphragm, which form the floor of the pelvic cavity. We'll look at these structures first in a male specimen. Piriformis and obturator internus are both hip rotator muscles, which arise within the pelvis and pass outward through the sciatic foramina. Here's piriformis. Piriformis arises from here on the sacrum. It passes laterally and leaves the pelvis through the greater sciatic foramen. We'll see where it goes in a minute. Next, we'll add obturator internus to the picture. Obturator internus arises from the obturator membrane and from this wide area around it. Obturator internus leaves the pelvis through the lesser sciatic foramen. In doing so, it makes a 90-degree turn around the lower part of the ischium. Piriformis and obturator internus pass laterally to insert on the greater trochanter of the femur. Their actions as lateral hip rotators are shown in Volume 2 of this atlas. In this section, we're concerned to understand these two muscles simply as parts of the wall of the pelvic cavity. The obturator internus muscle is covered on the inside by this layer of pelvic fascia. There's an important line of thickening in the fascia called the tendinous arch. The tendinous arch goes from the body of the pubis to the ischial spine. We'll see why the tendinous arch is important in a moment. Now we'll move on to look at the muscles of the pelvic diaphragm. These muscles form a sling which closes off the inferior pelvic aperture and supports the organs that lie within the pelvic cavity. On each side, the pelvic diaphragm is formed by two most unequal muscles, the small coccygeus muscle behind and the much larger and more important levator ani muscle in front. Here's the coccygeus muscle. It runs from the ischial spine to the edge of the lower sacrum and coccyx. Coccygeus is a vestigial muscle with no demonstrable function. Now we'll add the levator ani muscle to the picture. Here's the levator ani. The levator ani has a line of origin that's partly bone and partly fascia. In front, it arises from the body of the pubis. Behind, it arises from the ischial spine. Between these two bony origins, it arises from the tendinous arch in the fascia that overlies obturator internus. The fibers of levator ani pass downwards, backwards, and medially to meet in the midline with those of the opposite side, as we'll see shortly. Let's go round to the back to see the underside of levator ani. Here's the ischial tuberosity. Here's the sacrotuberous ligament. The space between these structures and the underside of the levator ani is called the ischiorectal fossa. In the living body, it's filled with fat. The levator ani is described as having a number of parts, which are named as though they were separate muscles. Unfortunately, the names of these parts are somewhat irrational. This part of levator ani is known as iliococcygeus. Iliococcygeus is very thin. This part is pubococcygeus. It's much more substantial. Pubococcygeus is subdivided further in ways that we won't go into. Now that we've looked at one levator ani muscle, let's look at the two of them together. We're looking from above. Here's the upper part of obturator internus. Here's the tendinous arch. The ischial spines are here. Here's the tip of the coccyx. Here are the coccygeus muscles. Here are the two levator ani muscles. Between them, in front, there's a gap, the urogenital hiatus, through which pass the rectum, the urethra, and, in the female, the vagina. The fibers of levator ani, which arise more posteriorly, unite in the midline with this fibrous band, the anococcygeal ligament. The fibers which arise more anteriorly form a loop which passes around the back of the urogenital hiatus. Some fibers along the edge of the hiatus attach to the sides of the rectum, the urethra, and, in the female, the vagina. We'll add the urethra and the rectum to the picture. Here's the lowest part of the rectum. Here's the urethra, with the lowest part of the prostate in front of it. We'll see these structures in Volume 5 of this atlas. The levator ani and coccygeus muscles are covered over by this dense layer of pelvic fascia, which completes the pelvic diaphragm on the inside. The pelvic diaphragm supports the pelvic organs and closes off the pelvic outlet while allowing passage for the rectum, vagina, and urethra. When we're upright, the levator ani muscles are in a constant state of tonic contraction, which becomes greater or less in response to changes in abdominal pressure. The main action of the levator ani muscles is to keep a set of downwardly mobile structures, the pelvic organs, constantly in one place. In addition, vigorous contraction of the levator ani muscles pulls the lower end of the rectum upwards and forwards. Now that we've seen the intact pelvic diaphragm from above, let's look at it from behind and from beneath. Here are the ischial tuberosities. Here's the tip of the coccyx. Here are the sacrotuberous ligaments. Here are the two levator ani muscles. This is the ischio-coccygeus part. This is pubococcygeus. Here's the urogenital hiatus. Here's the anococcygeal ligament. The levator ani muscles are continuous on the underside with this cone-shaped sleeve of muscle, the external anal sphincter, which maintains closure of the anus. Here's the opening of the anus. The external anal sphincter is tethered to the anococcygeal ligament by its most posterior fibers. In front, here's the divided urethra. The muscle surrounding it is the bulbospongiosus. Till now, we've been looking at the pelvic diaphragm in a dissection of a male body. Here's a similar dissection of the pelvic diaphragm of a female body. The overall structure of the female pelvic diaphragm is the same as the male, except that the pelvic diaphragm is also traversed by the vagina. Here's the opening of the urethra. The whole region between the coccyx, the ischial tuberosities, and the pubic symphysis is called the perineum. The area between the ischiopubic rami is the urogenital triangle. We'll look at the important structures of the urogenital triangle in Volume 5 of this atlas. We've been looking from behind at an isolated dissection of the pelvic diaphragm, with everything else removed. To get a more complete view of where we are, we'll now add the main surrounding structures to the picture. To see the pelvic diaphragm clearly, we've been looking at an unnaturally empty pair of ischiorectal fossae. In the living body, the ischiorectal fossa is filled with fat, which is traversed by nerves and vessels, as we'll see. Here are the sacrotuberous ligaments. Here are the ischial tuberosities. Here are piriformis and obturator internus, going to their insertions on the femur, along with the gemelli and quadratus femoris. Here's the sciatic nerve, emerging below piriformis. Here's gluteus medius. Here are the origins of the hamstring muscles. Here's the line of origin of gluteus maximus, which will add to the picture. The lower edge of gluteus maximus covers up the ischiorectal fossa when seen from behind. On the inside, the walls of the pelvic cavity are covered with a layer of loose connective tissue, which is lined in part by peritoneum. We'll see this in a minute when we move on to look at the blood vessels and nerves of the region. Before we do that, let's review what we've seen of the pelvic muscle.